I thought I'd start with Rohini. Hi, everybody. Since she's joining us remotely, I thought we'd feel good if she can first weigh in. So some years ago, I was in Jaffna, and I was meeting with somebody there, and we were generally discussing narratives about the war from Sri Lanka. And she was a local who had moved back into Sri Lanka, and she mentioned Rohini's book. And that's when I first read Rohini's book, and she said that the book sort of stood out not only for the narrative and the arc and the angle that she had done, but also in the sensitive way in which Rohini had managed to protect the people she was writing about. And so I thought I'd start with that. Rohini, how did you decide that this is how you want to tell the story of the war through these three people, and what made you take that artistic choice, that call of how to tell this story?
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually. For me, it's good morning. In fact, actually, it wasn't an artistic choice. I think it was a choice of process. It came from the limitations and the opportunities that reporting in a place where you're not supposed to report, and where people don't have time to talk to journalists, and where they're just sort of still processing their own stories. In this situation, I was reporting. And I mean, I have done that in the past as a journalist in other situations as well. But here, especially, given that every word that people were saying had a cost, both in the later stages in their life, they knew that very well, and also had the cost of them spending such a wasteful time with the journalist. Instead they could be looking for food or figuring out something else, or just sitting and kind of healing themselves after the war. So I think at that time I ended up speaking to several people in that way, and whoever was available. And then at some point it became my choice. Initially it was just I was just taking what people would give me, and whenever they trusted me, which was very, very rare actually. And given that I was an Indian reporting in Sri Lanka in the post-war situation, I was often assumed to be a person from RAW, actually. And it was initially it was a joke, but I thought it was a joke, and I was frustrated by it. But actually later I came to understand that there is a strong, a strong factual basis to this fear, and it wasn't paranoia at all. But once I won the trust of some people, I kept going back to some of those people, and that's when I exercised my choice. And then I explored at least, I think I would say 8 or 9 people, even 12, I would say, who I kept going back to. And some of these, I didn't have a structure or anything. It was my first book, and I had no idea. I mean, I'm working on another book now, and I still don't have any idea. So it's not about the first or second, but I just didn't know what I was doing, except that I knew how to do the reporting. So I was just doing that, and I would keep going back to some of them. And as their narrative of what they had experienced sort of unfurled in front of my eyes, I started to realize whose stories I wanted to say. And I chose to, in the end, it was a frustrating process of having to choose. I balanced the verifiable information that I had, the information that I could verify as much as possible, and then also my sense of how close to their truth it was, how true they were being to me. And this is, it's not, if they couldn't remember something, or if they didn't want to say something to me, I can't, and it's a huge gap in their story, I didn't mind. I still went with that. And the third was just, how much they trusted me. If they felt and if they welcomed me again and again and didn't mind talking to me after that. Sometimes it was friendship, sometimes they wanted stories out from Sri Lanka, and sometimes it was just that they didn't have anyone else to talk to. So a combination of this made me choose 3 people who I then later had to kind of think for myself, whether it's okay to write about 3 Tamil people in a conflict. And you know, or did I have to balance like 3 different communities, major communities in Sri Lanka, like Muslim, Sinhala, and Tamil. And I realized that if I had one of each will have to speak for their entire community. But if I had 3, I could explore from the Tamil community, who was the biggest victim and also participant in the war. I could let them speak in all nuances, in all flaws. I could allow more range of their story, and that would be truer to the truth than a balance of all 3.
Right. That's great. In fact, I was going to ask Jaideep if you faced something similar, when you were looking to write Ram Rao, for instance. You must have met, dozens of hundreds of farmers during reporting. And how is it that you figured that this story is going to be a book, and this story is going to be how I tell the story of the agrarian distress, of the farmers' plight in Maharashtra? What was it about this character that sort of...
Well, I met him in 2013, a couple of days after he had attempted to commit suicide. And by reporting, in 1996 onward, I have extensively reported on the suicide, so much so that in one of the events I was actually introduced as a journalist expert on suicides, which kind of shook me. And that's not what I intend to do, I thought to myself. Basically, the story is not about death, it's about life. It's about how people live in the countryside. So Ram Rao's meeting was one of those meetings. I mean, I've met several people who, attempted suicide and survived. But, with Ram Rao, I was more concerned about his life because in my extensive interactions with a lot of farmers, managed to understand that if someone is in depression, clinical depression, or, you got to first, my first reaction was that he's not in, good state. He needs a little bit of support, otherwise he'll slip back into depression. So that was my preliminary response. I was not really intending to write. But over a period of that 1 year, 2013-14, I realized that, he is very articulate. And my first question to him was, the first day was then, how did you come to this stage? And it's that question that he's sort of answering over a period of time. I think it was in 2015 I decided that, if I have to tell the story of life of an everyday farmer, then this man who survived a very serious attempt on his life will be able to tell me stories that would sort of synthesize the stories of so many people who are not with us today, unfortunately, to tell what exactly happened. Was it a love affair as the government would like to believe us? Or was it a family feud as, some police officers would like to believe us? Or is it something, or a combination of several things? So I think, just as Rohini was saying, I think in the non-fiction, that's the fun. The stories evolve, they organically evolve, and they kind of show up. The only thing is, I think you have to stock those stories, you have to keep at it. And I think I decided to stay with Ram Rao for a few years, so that the story evolves. As one of the reviewers actually pointed out in her review, that in the first chapter itself, a dramatic, incident happens in his life. What else can be more dramatic? But as I were to find out, actually the life is more dramatic than one can make out. So I thought, Ram Rao's life actually evolves, and it tells, it evolves and it shows up. So I just had to only tell the story. The narrative evolved. 20-25 years of reporting in Vidarbha is pretty good enough a time to really look at it as a historic, what happened in quarter of a century, really. Economic policies, the chemical pesticides, the debate over BT cotton, hundreds of studies, one study after the other study after the other study, several compensation doles, etc., etc. And yet the life of a farmer hasn't really improved, which means that We are fundamentally, doing something wrong. The other thing is I always wanted to do a book on farm crisis, but I was very sure that it had to be on about life rather than about death. So I think this kind of, to me, came out as a story that can explain to a very common reader. See, rural India is itself a subject that is not really a cool subject. I mean, I have struggled all my journalistic career to actually sell my stories. And I would be fortunate if 2 of my 10 stories ended up in the newspapers. I consider myself to be really very, very fortunate and very lucky. And that has been the case. 10 stories delivered, 2 published. I'm saying, okay, fine, this is good. 2 stories are good. Now, with that strike rate, I was not really, sure whether this book will really appeal to any publisher, but it did. And I'm really grateful to my publisher, my editor, that they chose to publish it. So it was basically telling what is happening is also important 50 years down the line. If any researcher wants to take a look at the period between 2002 and 20, all you will read is about great things happening in this country 50 years from now. So someone also has to say that there was a flip side to development. There was a flip side to what was that campaign, that 2002-3 campaign, the India Shining campaign. Not to pick up the jargon, but there is a flip side to Indian economic story. And it's not about statistics. When we say 400,000 farmers killed themselves, they had faces, they were husbands, they were women, they were mothers, So Ram Rao to me kind of typifies, and I'm really thankful that he allowed me to tell his story, allowed me that, entry into his private life, and sort of said, okay, write whatever you want. So through him, I've tried to explain what this crisis is all about, what is countryside going through in times like these. We don't know many stories about the countryside, and I hope that with my interest in focusing on the stories of countryside, maybe, the stories of the water crisis, the afternoon session, climate change. I mean, climate change is an issue, but how does it show up? What do people face? What do they go through? These are the stories, I guess, that need more exploration, deep diving, little patience, As a journalist, I would really be frustrated by writing those 500 to 1,000 word stories about a tragedy and a human kind of drama that is completely, I don't have the tools and expertise to explain a story like this in 500 words. So I thought it needs many stories and many stories with many words. So that's how it evolved.
Lovely. I'll come to Ajitha at the end. Before I come to Ajitha, I have a question for Rukmini. That is, you're a data journalist. And what pushed you to sort of go looking beyond the numbers, which is you're sort of doing something that is, what shall I say, outside of, again, what you can't do in the newspapers, in a sense. And, why did you decide that you had to, deconstruct this data? What exactly happened that made you want to write this book?
So when I started off as a journalist, as a junior field reporter, I had no idea of data, and I was a sort of rookie reporter dispatched all over the city. I was in Mumbai at the time, and then later on in Maharashtra, and then over time I was sent to other places to report as well. So I would call myself a field reporter. And then from 2010 onwards, through a series of other events, I started focusing on data journalism. And it seemed to me that these two elements of journalism were not speaking to each other, perhaps in my writing, but definitely within Indian newsrooms as well. And it has an impact on, sort of both sides of our understanding of the country. Not having data enter into regular reporting has an impact on the rigor of regular journalism. And not having field reporting enter into data journalism, leads you to believe uncritically in data, which, as I know from my years in the field, is a problematic direction to go in. I completely agree with Jaideep that, I too experienced the frustrations of having to cram words, and I worked at the Times of India, so it was often 350 and 400 words. So, we're going to have a competition to the bottom over here. I too struggle to say much in that. And one of the things that happened, and it's essentially how these stories have entered, because, some of the stories in my book are sort of typical stories, which is they are illustrating the point that the data is making. But some of them are not. They are tangential, and they are the ones I enjoy in particular because reality is messy, and journalism flattens reality into an unrecognizable caricature of reality. I end up having to do that often in my journalism too. But the people who I met who didn't fit into my 350 word copies would typically go into a word file that I would call extras and leave it in the folder. The folder would be Bundelkhand, and there'd be one word file called extras. They were stories of people who were interesting and had said, unusual things to me, but they weren't talking about, say, the price of dal, so they didn't fit into that story. And some of them have made it into the book. And I suppose my sort of appeal to journalism, just in all the things that all of us want journalism to do better, I also want journalism to take these sort of flights of fancy, flights of whimsy that we all encounter in real life. I keep saying that you cannot have an uninteresting conversation with an Indian. It's impossible. People love to tell you, perhaps too much, right? You get into such shockingly deep conversations on a 20-minute train ride. So, but we don't see any of that in journalism. And so I suppose my pitch is for journalism to do all the things that Jaideep talks about, all of the important issues of the day that we need to talk about. But I would also like to see more of the messiness of reality reflected in these stories. Jaideep's book begins with poems, right? And I would imagine you would find it very hard to put that into a news story. But how fascinating it is to know about the inner life of a farmer that doesn't have to do with the price of fertilizer all the time. They're poets too, they're people with all of their multitudes. So I suppose that's my pitch for more of the extras file to make it into regular journalism.
So before I come to Ajitha, I have one more question for you, which is, when this whole Aryan Khan case happened, I was reading, what was in your book. And was there if something that can happen to somebody that big is exactly what you're explaining in the book, in which in her book she talks about, how we get these cases filed against some people, and then there are these panchas who are routinely used by the police. Habitual panchas, who are basically people who are routinely used by the police for multiple cases. And these are all of these things that played out in that big case that we all watched, and now we know in detail, is actually there in her book. And she talks about how this happens to hundreds of people. And so I wanted to, ask you what it was like, seeing what is in your book unfold in real life.
That's a great point. And it also points to one particularly unusual feature of the Indian police, which is that they are all script writers. So FIRs in India follow scripts because the cops have sort of worked it out into almost an algorithm, which they feel is... which they feel is what will help get them a conviction. So the cases that I looked at in the book, I was looking at something else in Mumbai's district courts, and I found that metropolitan magistrates every day in Mumbai, for the period I was looking at, were dealing with IPC section 328, which is causing hurt using a poisonous substance. And why there was this epidemic of IPC 328 in Mumbai at the time made no sense to me until I went on and did some investigation and realized that the drug mephedrone, which is called meow meow on the street, was not in the NDPS, the narcotics schedule at the time. So the police had decided that this was the way they were going to go after peddlers, put the IPC section of causing hurt using a poisonous substance. The problem is, for conviction under IPC 328, you need to show intent to cause hurt. It's usually used for food adulteration, particularly if there was intention. There's no intention to cause hurt between a peddler and his customer. So there was a 100% acquittal rate. Now, if you saw IPC 328 in the police statistics and you saw a 100% acquittal rate, you'd be like, my God, such lenient judges, what's going on? But this is what was going on then. So, all of those, so many of those FIRs followed the same script, which was the complainant says that her younger brother or nephew or son became friendly with somebody who then plied him with a white substance, and then he, as it followed from then. And this isn't unusual to drugs, as I write about quite a bit in the book. This is also deployed in something far more serious, which is in sexual assault cases. So I was seeing, for example, in case after case, that there was this, the complainant was administered an intoxicant-laced cold drink in a crowded market. Dozens and dozens and dozens of these cases. And I lived in Delhi at the time, and I was honestly scared that there was some sort of epidemic of, intoxicant-laced cold drinks going around in the city. But what was happening is that these were cases involving consenting young couples against whom cases were being filed by typically the girl's parents. They were often intercaste and interreligious relationships. And to show that the woman went with the man without her consent, the cops have to show vitiation of consent, which means her consent was taken away in some form to get a conviction. If she was intoxicated, then she couldn't have given consent. So really, India's best script writers are its police.
So finally, we come to the editor, Ajitha, who's actually published 3 of our books here. I actually wanted to get all the journalists in, all of us in, before we come to you, because we're also part of the problem, which is why I wanted to ask you, why is narrative nonfiction doing so well in India? Is it that news is failing us? Clearly, that's what, yeah. It's possibly because mainstream news isn't enough, there's too much propaganda. What is it?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of what Rukmini said, that you all are such good writers, and what you say. But it is also, I think, in my experience of publishing, which precedes 2014, and the sort of political trajectory since, and what it's done to sort of, the acceleration of misinformation, of fake news, of the fading away of a shared reality. At some level, I think that is also what Rukmini's book, for instance, is trying to do, which is also kind of established through data a sort of a base from which we can all talk about, about India, perhaps, So I think certainly, I think we are kind of obsessively consuming news now because the pace of change of what is happening, it's, every day something really big has happened. So I think it is partly that, that the mainstream media is, of course, no longer where we are turning to for the definite account of what is happening. The fact that journalists are on social media so much means that I think, regular readers are more familiar with journalists than they were before. And by familiar, I mean like a lot of people on Twitter might feel like, Rukmini wrote to me, I know her. Or, like, you are off Twitter now, but like when you respond, it's like you say, well, I read your book, and and you get a response out of that. I think that has helped the growth of the non-fiction segment in book publishing. I think there is an acceleration of good writing. It is just a fact that there really is a lot of good writing that that all of us are publishing, and across publishers. So there is that. And I think that the more good nonfiction we publish, I think there is an incentive to write more good nonfiction. So I think it's a mix of all of these things. But I do think that it's having its moment in India for sure.
Jobless. I mean, we have also lost our jobs. I mean, let us not forget that. I mean, that's a fact. Lots of journalists who have lost their jobs have they're turning into authors now.
It's the truth. So while I look at my notes, I also want to insist that you guys please buy, all of our books. Mine also, but mostly, the three of their books. They're really, really good. And if you haven't figured out by now, one of them is written about the Sri Lankan war. Rohini also has written long form about the NRC in Assam, right, Rohini? And Jaideep's book is, of course, the latest book is called Ram Rao, and before that, he's written another book called The Village Awaits Doomsday, and that has been translated to Hindi as well. Yeah. And that is also about people in rural India and how they are displaced by development, both private and public. And of course, Rukmini's book is the star, and everybody's read it, but if you haven't, you have to. It's called Whole Numbers and Half Truths. So please buy everybody's book. I'm coming back to Rohini, I think, for this one. What were you reading when you were writing this book? Do you remember? I know it was a while ago.
Yeah, I do actually. A couple of books which I still remember. But could I add a couple of thoughts to what?
Yes, please do. And please, any of you, when you feel like adding something, add in as well. Yeah.
I think it's also really true that any journalist anywhere always has extra stories, and anywhere in the world, people who are journalists who are writing even 5,000 words will have 10,000 or 80,000 words to write. And I mean, not everyone, but there are many. So there always is a yearning to tell stories not just in a longer format, but in a better way, in a more complex way. And I also think that the running around of journalism, where every day is different, makes some of us start really becoming desperate for a longer relationship. Really, you just want to just stick to one and be obsessed with it, and that is, I think, and it could be you pulling from different stories that you said. Be one subject. It could be something that you feel you want to challenge yourself. These are all my reasons, and I know that these are reasons for many journalists. And of course, the dropping of quality of your own product in your daily journalism, maybe possibly because of your own exhaustion, a combination of that, and also that editors don't ask much more of you, or like you think that nobody cares about reading, whatever, our cynicism after some years, then you just want to do something else which creatively challenges you, which creatively challenges the audience, the readers, and publishers also seeing. This is my more practical answer. That is that I think a lot of publishers feel journalists will give stories. They'll finish their books faster than many other authors. And I think a lot of times I can see fellowship being given to journalists because they will finish faster than academics, and they will finish. Mostly, they will finish. The churn of the current story, it's not only journalists that are being asked for it, right? Like also newsmakers are being asked to write very fast stories, 50,000 words. You have, it may be good or bad. I think that includes goes for us as well. So there is also, I think as publishing realizes how it will also make more income from which field, which writer, it's also that, I think. I'm also realizing this from, this is all over the world, I think, but especially in India. In terms of what I was reading, when I was when I was doing my book, initially I started reading stuff that is written by Sri Lankans, also others who had written about Sri Lanka. Though Sri Lankans from Sri Lanka or diaspora who've written about Sri Lanka in different ways, not just about the civil war, have mostly been novelists or essay writers or short story writers. And this was probably because everyone is making sense of their lives and their not just trauma, but this is combination of many things: movement, many people who left as refugees, many people who left out of by losing hope in the future of their country and going somewhere else and living. So the diaspora, people who leave where they belong, process it and need an outlet. So many of these fiction and stunning fiction by Rohan Gunasekara, and even funny book like Shehan Gunatilaka, who wrote Chinaman, so hilarious, but actually it is so, it captures Sri Lanka so well. I read these because I was writing, I had an outsider complex because I was afraid that I will end up being extremely blind to the realities, the normal daily realities. I don't feel nervous about it all in India, even about Orissa. Not like I know anything and I grew up in Orissa or something, but I go and report there and write. But if I was writing a book, I might be more nervous, right? Because the small things that come alive in a book. And this may be something that I became alive to by reading their novels. Because it's filled with the everyday, small, like the garnish. It's not just the garnishes, but it's just the comfort with which you pick one ingredient and the other. It's just a combination of what their life is like. Can I bring the accent of Sri Lanka in my English writing without, by really capturing it? Then the book, then I read some of the war books, which, around the world, but most of those were, again, written by outsiders to that context, often white men writing about brown countries. And I hated that language. And I just somehow, even the best books, although I could admire the way it was written and the guts with which they have done stuff, I felt really like it was alienating, and it was it was written in too cool a format. We shouldn't feel like I want to be there in a conflict. We should feel like I hope this never happens in our lives. I felt like war books should be, for me at least, and this is my extreme anti-war personality, writing about a civil war. I was also feeling a sense of warning in my mind, because a big reason I was reporting on Sri Lanka is that I was feeling the fears of where the polarization in India would go. And I'm talking about 2009. That is when I started working on this book. And this is before, what is happening today. It was much more, I was feeling like not just ethnic polarization, but this comfort with war hitting into central India, just in the name of Naxalism, in Kashmir, in so many other parts of India where violence was a state solution for things. So then I think it was Adichie's book, Chimamanda Adichie, who's now a person that people think they shouldn't read because of other reasons and her support for J.K. Rowling and all of that. But her book, Half of a Yellow Sun, really it rooted me immediately. It was a person from diaspora writing a novel about war in her country, Nigeria, and it really rooted me because it made me feel like, I can write in all the complexities I'm seeing. I can write intermingling lives if they are not even connected fully. It has two sisters in that book that are the leads, but it freed me to write in the way that was coming easily to me. So I think that these were the books. And of course, there are like lots of subject-related books that would be there, but this, in terms of language, was what
Right.
freed me.
Right, right. Before I bring the same question to both of you, because she touched upon something else that I wanted to talk about, which is the imposter syndrome, especially for journalists can't afford to have it because we have to just get the story out. But then when you're doing the book, you can't help but feel like, am I really qualified enough to talk about this? Or am I the right person to talk about this? Am I saying it the correct way? Is this offensive? So you have so many self-doubts. And with you, you were in rural Maharashtra. You were there for a long time. But at what point did you feel like, I don't feel like an outsider here anymore?
See, linking her point and her point, basically, why is there a sudden interest in Indian stories? Why is there a boom? I think I'll come to your question, but I just thought that this point needs to be made, that if you look at Indian media and their journalism today, it is very, very centered around a few cities. That's India. 4 or 5 cities, that's it. Whereas the countrywide story today is in the hinterland and the heartlands. You take cricket, you take music, you take films. By the way, there's another process of Indian films going on parallel to Indian non-fiction writing, which is you are seeing the emergence and resurgence of a new cinema where hinterland and heartland stories are being told by exceptionally talented filmmakers in the very small budgets, whether it's Telugu, Tamil, language films, etc. It's not just the English writing journalism. It's also language non-fiction that is also, taking shape right now. A lot of good writing is happening in Hindi, non-fiction. So I think that is a vacuum in which all of us operate. We are finding an opportunity because Indian hugely empowered, hugely political and moneyed media has left huge spaces open for us to score goals. 4 or 5 cities, the rest of the countries are ours. And I don't call myself a subaltern voice, but I am a regional voice. I don't identify myself with a national Delhi or a Bombay-centric voice. I am rooted in the countryside. I come from small town. My entire upbringing, friendship, entire cultural, all other mannerisms are very small town kind of thing. I'm a very laid back thing. So I identify with the stories around me. And because the publishing industry or the internet or the web publishing or digital technology is actually linking us with a global and a national audience, which was not possible 15, 20 years ago. So here is a time when we can actually experiment to tell stories directly from the ground, local stories globally. I think that's what is one process I think is happening. The question of what Rohini pointed out, I think many of us may not have had tools to explore these storytelling formats 20 years ago. But again, some of the global wisdom or the national wisdom or wisdom of great writers, good writers is now coming to us very easily. There's a new publishing there are new editors like hers who are ready to publish those books because they know there is interest in those books. So it's just the matter of finding stories from the hinterland and heartland and telling those stories. We are close. I feel Ram Rao, I am close to Ram Rao because I live with him. I have helped so many journalists from across the world and from across Indian national dailies to report on Vidarbha that every time they would come, I would say, oh, this guy has again missed the story. You know why? Because most journalists, there was only one team from South Korea, which I admired very. They were the only journalists who traveled with me in the countryside and said, we want to visit a field. Farmer has committed suicide. Journalists would come in by the morning flight, and thank God there are flights now to Nagpur. 15 years ago, there were no flights, so there were no journalists coming. But because there are direct flights to Nagpur, so a lot of my friends would come by morning flight, fly back by evening flights and telling loads of wisdom, which even 20, 25 years down the line, I don't feel that I've understood my region correctly. But they tell, so the thing is, the Korean journalists were the only journalists who came and said, we also want to visit the field. And I said, wow, the story is in the field. There's something happening, something has gone wrong in the field. Maybe there's no water, maybe the rains have failed, the crops have wilted, the cotton has not fetched a price. Family is not a story. The man has gone. There's a tragic story unfolding, but the big picture is in the field. So that was the only time. So I would feel, oh my goodness, this is the story that we need to tell. You know, one chapter of my book deals greatly, in great details. The longest chapter is on the BT cotton. And I tried to explain it as simplifying it as possible, but I wanted to bring that longishness because the thing is, the reader ought to know that they're not dealing with, pests. You're dealing with complex sets of synthetic pyrethrides. It's chemistry happening in the field where Ramarao doesn't understand this white powder, what does it mean? The shop owner tells him, put it in water and throw it. And when nothing works, you bring 5-10 different powders, put it in water, then mix it well, and then you spray it, and while spraying you die. That's what happened in Vidarbha 3-4 years ago. Hundreds of people simply died of inhalation because they were not sure what were they inhaling. It was like, in one report, government report, where they described, it was like, they were like walking into the gas chamber. He was spraying and walking like this. So it was like, he was creating his own gas chamber. What a description. The official report describes it. So the thing is, audiences, readers must know when you're wearing a white cotton t-shirt, that cotton how has it been grown? Where is that t-shirt coming from? Who is growing it? If you are eating wheat, chapati, how is the wheat grown? If you're drinking milk, how is that milk coming? What is the process? What's the back end and linkages? I think all those stories now need attention because countrywide Indian great stories are happening in the hinterland, heartlands. Big innovations are happening in small towns. I was reading a beautiful book called Mobile Girls Scootum, which just came out, Zuban Books. Amazing story. It's written not by a journalist but by a researcher, academician. But now these stories have interest. There are readers who would want to know, and many of us do have some connect with small town. Migration is happening. People living in Bangalore, there are people from Vidarbha who are living in Bangalore. They would want to read about it. The mainstream media simply doesn't report. So I think that's an opportunity for all of us to kind of explore.
Right. I know Rohini wanted to intervene in the middle. No? I thought she did this.
No, I raised my hand because I was one of the people that Jaideep often helped. So I raised my hand and he was saying journalists would come and I would take, So I just raised my hand saying I'm also one of them.
Okay. So I'd come to you with the sort of similar question, which is what were you reading and what about this whole imposter syndrome when you're sitting down to, I know you, maybe not so much is when it comes to the data part of it, but more when it comes to like the story part of the book, where you talking.
No, I have a huge imposter syndrome when it comes to the data part of it because I have no training in math, statistics, economics, politics, anything of any value. I did a BA in psychology for reasons I could not tell you anymore, just drifted into it. And now I do data stuff. My first day on the job, I had to learn how to do plus and minus in Excel. So huge imposter syndrome over here. And I don't have a good solution to that. When I talk to young students now, I recommend that they, understand a bit of statistics and get some tech skills as well. Don't manually read code documents the way I did. All cautionary tales of things not to do. But perhaps the one advantage that it gives me is that because I am a lay person interpreting numbers, maybe it gives me an advantage in talking to other lay people because, I can't say complicated things about numbers because I don't know complicated things about numbers. So perhaps it makes it easier for people to understand. In terms of what I was reading at the time, so I was reading a couple of books by other fellow journalists that had been published recently because, publishing was an entirely new space to me. The thought of a book hadn't occurred to me until a few months before I wrote it. I was really, completely immersed in regular reporting. So I read my friend M. Raj Shekhar's book and Dreamers by Singta Poonam, trying to understand how how journalists are going about capturing India at the moment. I also tried to read a little bit of other people who wrote on data, because I had this fear that I wouldn't be able to communicate it in an interesting fashion enough. I think, already I saw the terrified expressions of editors a couple of times when you threatened to write a book about, not you Ajitha, present company excluded. When you threaten to write a book about data, it's already a bit daunting for editors. So I read books like Everyone Lies, Dataclysm, other people who write using numbers to see how they weave in stories. So I can't say that I found in Invisible Women, I can't say that I found one particular model, because I would say that there is sometimes a script to how data journalists write as well, which is you start with a story in paragraph 1, then in paragraph 2 you zoom out to explain how that person fits into the broader story. A lot of writing with data does that, because it's sort of broken down as this is the way, don't start with numbers. Numbers scare people. So humanize, start with a story. So I read that and then I rejected a lot of it as well.
Just wanted to add one thing. I was grappling with my book. I had to start again because it was not working. The initial manuscript, the drafts were not working because I was writing it with mind. So my better half said, you go back to Nimisha, my daughter, who's the 8-year-old then, read her book. So I started with Charlotte's Web, Faraway Tree, because the thing is, I had to drop my mind and bring my heart into play. And it really helped. Charlotte's Web really helped because it has such beautiful descriptions. So, all the description and the way, you write with your heart, all that came with all those classics.
Right. Yeah, it's a moving book. It's a very moving book. Yeah. So before do we have time for one question from Ajitha? Who? Okay, nobody's in charge, so I'm in charge, so I'm good. So I'm just going to ask Ajitha one last question before I throw it open to the audience, and that is a question that everybody wants to know. What are you looking for when you're looking, when a non-fiction proposal is coming to you, for a book? What exactly are you looking for now?
I'll start with responding to what Rohini had said. It's true that journalists deliver, there is this idea that, okay, a journalist will deliver quickly because they're in the practice of writing to deadlines and that sort of thing. But it's not like that is not how we actually look at it, Rohini. It's more that, when we want to read about what's happening in the moment, and we want to understand this moment in some depth. And who do you go to but the people who are interpreting this moment, which is you guys, because you're reporting on it, you're analyzing it, you're collecting data on it, you're speaking to people that are affected by it, all of this. So we go to you to understand what's happening now, There will be academic studies. We will, in 15, 20 years, have perhaps a much deeper perspective of, of all that we're going through today. But we also need to understand it now. And I think that is certainly one kind of thing that I think we've been looking for. I can only speak for myself in context. The other thing that, that I think when I think of a context book, I think it is that there is complexity in understanding whatever it is, whether it is whether you're looking at data, whether it's investigative journalism, whether it's narrative nonfiction, which is telling one, a few threads of a story. It's whatever it is, it's there is that, there is a complexity of understanding of analytical breadth. There is political engagement. And by political engagement, I don't mean that it has to be my politics. I mean, the authors politically engaged with whatever they're writing. So I know that is one part of what I'm looking for. Good writing is always welcome, of course. Like that is part of what we look for. But yeah, good books, yeah.
Okay, so now I think we can open it out to the audience.
Could I just say one thing that is my audio on? Yeah. Also, thanks for correcting me, Ajitha. It's just my cynical view of some editors, not you. So, but I did want to say that it's not only books that is long form. I think you mentioned that, like, I think there is space to explore other forms of storytelling. I tried to do some screenwriting courses. I found it very hard, but I'm sure other people will, because I took my fiction story, non-fiction story, and tried to make it a fiction maybe too soon, and I was too attached to the characters, and I felt like, no, I'm not going to compress all the feminist influences into this person's life into one sister. I can't do it. Like, that's what maybe fiction asks you to do sometimes. Just make the story neater, while reality maybe is more messy. So I didn't. But that is a direction in which we can take our extras folder really also. I think, and also when I did it was one of my few data stories, I would say, where I filed RTIs to understand how foreigners' tribunals work and whether there is bias in it, and it was 500 plus court documents. But I wrote that in a narrative style, which is anyway what we want. But in India also, there is Article 14. There are places that do take long stories, not just by length, but by the time you take to do it also. And then from there, I think I did some videos in which I'm using my data as they are kind of like extended TED Talks. I don't know, it wasn't that great, but I think with practice I could become better, and others could also do that. Others could be much better at it, where people who may not read a 5,000 word story can still access in a longer format than a 2-minute video. There are other ways, I think, of telling our stories. And then it gave me, I could show the pictures, much more pictures of, I would just put one picture and over it talk with some data and like what I found and some maps. And I brought in some of my own ideas of what citizenship, how I started thinking about my own citizenship. So, I think there are other ways. I just wanted to say, because this is about long form, it can't always be books, and not all of us can get published. And maybe as books, there are other formats. I just wanted to say.
Right. Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah. Hi. My question. I have a question. Can I ask? Okay. Can I ask?
Who is it for, or can anyone?
It's for all the writers. So, like, how do all of you have decades of experience covering multiple topics amongst all three of you here? How do you decide, that this is going to be my book as opposed to, say, something else? If you could give any insight into the pre-production process.
Okay, so I'll take this question because I've also written a book. So I think in my case, it was, I wrote about the Chennai floods of 2015. And so in my case, it was a question of what I had personally been through. So I had gone through the flood, and there weren't really many books that were about floods in India at that time. And in a fit of rage one day, when we had just gone home and my entire home was demolished, and basically the structure stood, but everything inside the house was gone and rotting in sewage, basically. And in a fit of rage, I wrote a proposal and sent it to my agent, and she immediately said, yes, you have to write about this. So sometimes anger, and I think a lot of us are driven at some point by some emotion into saying that, no, you know what, I have to talk about this, and there is more that needs to be said about this. Nobody else is saying it. Why is nobody else saying it? So that's possibly one reason when you're so closely engaged with something. But I would like to have somebody else also answer this question. Maybe Jaideep, you.
I think I have 2 or 3 things that I think for me are important. One is that I should think this is the most important story for me. I wouldn't care really if whether it has readers or whether, if I think this is the most important story for me to be told, that is number 1. Number 2, I should not get bored of this story even if I have to spend 10 years on it. So if I'm not getting bored of it, it is important for me, I'll go with it. And the third thing which is now important, as with Ramarao I found, it should have a narrative. The story should have a narrative. And the thing is, I think this is, I didn't get bored of, whatever subjects I work on, I usually take very long time. I am from Nagpur, it's a laid back town, 45-degree temperature, 8 months of working, 4 months of, so the thing is you have to work slow, but I don't get bored. Then I say, okay, sometimes some of these, I keep my ideas book, so there are ideas pouring in, because once you start writing, you feel that you can do all the books in the world, which you can't. Nevertheless, you can maintain a diary, and in the end of, couple of years, okay, out of 100 ideas, two might work. And I'm really not getting bored. I'm really more interested. So I think those are the basic things, I guess. They would be different for you. Motivation would be different for different writers.
Right. Sir, anybody else wants to ask something? Yeah.
Is there scope to self-publish books like these, and like how crucial is it to work with an editor, and how involved are they in this process that self-publishing might not really benefit from that sort of involvement?
Ajitha, do you want to take that?
So, I think, even if you were self-publishing, you could certainly hire the services of a professional editor and work with a good editor. Not all good editors are in publishing houses. They are outside as well. You could market your own book. You could, there are self-publishing companies that offer various kinds of sales packages and all of that. It would certainly help you retain complete editorial and all other control in terms of design and all of that. It's a lot of work. Also, I don't know, when I look at the books that we've published, whether in Context or Rekha or Red Panda or any of our imprints, I think of each of those books having siblings, like sitting in a shelf of other books that are also speaking to each other. But again, I think it's possible to self-publish. It's expensive to self-publish. You have to spend money on it if you want your book to get out and be available and all of that. But it's possible.
Yeah, so the one way that self-publishing has sort of helped me is that, so my book is being taught, Rivers Remember is being taught in 2 universities abroad in Canada, but I don't have a publisher in the US. So since I already had an Indian publisher and people know about my book, and it's now made it into a syllabus elsewhere. So at that point I decided I'm just going to self-publish it in Canada. And so my readers, the students who use the book there, they can sort of access it on Kindle, for a price, and I just get whatever they pay every semester. I just get the money myself. So that's one option, I would think.
If I were to make that point, I just have a point. I think editing is 99%, 1% is writing. It is. I'm process-wise. You write your first draft, second draft, third draft, you revise, clean, revise, go back.
Oh, yeah.
I'm saying the third eye, the editor's eye, is very crucial. It really takes your work to a very different level. Not just grammatical line, fine line editing. It's simply sometimes perspective that an editor's eye brings, which kind of remarkably transforms your work. So editorial intervention, to me, I might sound a little old-fashioned, but I think I would rather have an editorial eye to really look at the work.
Was that important for you as well, Rukmini, to have an editor?
Yes, it was important to have an editor, but also I don't think I did as much meticulous rewriting as Jaideep, because mine was a lockdown book, and I have young kids, and I had a brief period of babysitting, so I had to just bang it out in that time. I had the sword hanging over my head. As long as there was babysitting, I had to get the book out. So no, once it was done, I didn't want to look at it again. I just wanted it out there in the world.
Is there any more, or are we done? No, I think that's it. I think we are kind of done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
You're a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. And thank you to everybody. It's so nice to see a packed room. I'm so excited. Every time, I've been saying this at every session which I open and close, but thank you so much. The next session will start at 5. It's called the City Beat. Oh, thank you so much, Rohini. I'm so sorry I didn't look that side. Thank you so much, Rohini. The next session will begin in 15 minutes. You can grab a cup of coffee or tea. Please wash your mugs when you're done, and please come back. See you soon.